Well, Ethiopia and Eritrea returned to war. Just 6 years after Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed received the Nobel Prize for brokering peace with Asmara, the two now stand poised for conflict again. So can they be pulled back from the brink, or is another war imminent? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are Ethiopia and Eritrea. Just a few years ago, the leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea were close political allies, cynically fighting a common enemy in Ethiopia's Tigrayan region. Today, however, the two look set for a return to conflict, with Ethiopia even questioning Eritrea's hard-won independence from Addis Ababa dating back to 1993. Ethiopia lost its access to the Red Sea that year, and its leaders want it back. But Ethiopia is also fighting its own brutal internal conflicts, whereby Tigray continues to be a tinderbox and the Asmara region's Fano fighters battle government forces. Here's a look.
For 30 years, Eritreans fought a war the world barely saw. They fought not for power, but for recognition, a decades-long struggle to reclaim identity, self-rule, and a place in the world. When Eritrea declared independence in 1993, it took with it more than land. Ethiopia lost its only access to the sea. A state was born, but a coastline was lost. Two nations emerged side by side, bound by history, divided by a truce that proved too fragile. By 1998, that division turned to bloodshed. A border war over barren land killed more than 70,000 people and froze relations for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 2018, came the handshake that stunned the world. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed reopened the border and called it reconciliation. It earned him the Nobel Peace Prize and the trust of Isaias Afwerki, a man who had trusted no one for decades. But peace soon turned into a partnership of war. In 2020, Ethiopia and Eritrea launched a coordinated military offensive against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, an army that operated in an autonomous province in northeastern Ethiopia bordering Eritrea. The campaign killed an estimated 500,000 civilians and left the region devastated.
The government has actually weaponized food, and by taking the food aid that has been sent to the Tigrayan region, the government was basically trying to just use something we call scorched earth policy. It's something that has been banned in international humanitarian law.
3 years later, as international scrutiny mounted, Ethiopia signed the Pretoria Agreement with the TPLF. The war was paused, but old alliances began to fray. By 2025, former wartime partners had become wary neighbours. A new rift had opened, this time not in Tigray, but in neighbouring Amhara province in Ethiopia. Addis Ababa now accuses Eritrea of colluding with the banned Tigrayan faction to stoke war once again. In a letter to the United Nations, the foreign minister claimed Eritrea and the TPLF are funding and mobilising armed groups in Amhara province. Eritrea has not publicly responded to the letter, but tensions are rising, and the mistrust is no longer confined to the past. At the heart of this unravelling relationship lies a deeper fracture: Ethiopia's continued bid for access to the Red Sea.
The issue of the Red Sea is a matter of survival for Ethiopia. Whether the Prosperity Party is here or not, or whether this house is here or not, a nation of 130 million, whose economy is rapidly growing, cannot stay locked up. It can't.
Analysts warn that another Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict would not remain confined. The UAE, Egypt and Sudan all have stakes in these waters. Somaliland, unrecognised but strategically positioned, could also be drawn in, as ports become bargaining chips. What begins as a border dispute could ignite an entire coastline. 3 decades after independence, Eritrea still guards the sea it bled for. And Ethiopia still reaches for the sea it cannot touch. And the horn still stands where it always has, on the edge of memory and within reach of war.
So could Eritrea and Ethiopia return to all-out war? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, Eritrean political analyst Abdurrahman Syed, from Addis Ababa, assistant professor at the Ethiopian Civil Service University, Mukarrem Miftah, and from Cambridge in the UK, managing editor of Ethiopia Insight, William Davison. Thanks all so much for being with me. William, I'll start with you as an outside observer and ask, how to even reconcile the images of Abiy Ahmed accepting the 2019 Nobel Prize for brokering this historic border peace with Eritrea with where we are today and reports that the two are actually on the brink of armed conflict?
Yeah, there's certainly, obviously, there's a long distance that's been traveled there. I think perhaps we first have to understand that the nature of the rapprochement was, a high-level political agreement between the leaders. Of course, there were ambitions which were realized initially to some extent to reintroduce kind of full bilateral cooperation between the two countries, but they weren't fully successful. And then, ever since then, we've had the Tigray War from 2020 to 2022. That strengthened the partnership between the two leaderships in many ways, essentially as they united against their joint, shared opponents in Tigray, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And then really it's been two things since then that have led to a significant worsening of relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The first one has been the fallout from the end of the Tigray War, when essentially Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia decided to make peace with the TPLF. And it's widely understood that President Isaias Afwerki and his government, they really wanted to see something like the complete defeat of the TPLF in Tigray. So that was, the end of the honeymoon, let's say. And then since then, the other significant development among many has been the increasingly vocal ambitions of Ethiopia and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, notably, for Ethiopia to end its landlocked status and regain a port or coastal access, perhaps become a Red Sea power. And Ethiopia's landlocked status, which was something which came into being when the former province of Ethiopia, Eritrea, became independent in 1993.
Well, let me ask Abdurrahman, do you think Eritrea has a right to feel betrayed, in a sense, by the fallout from the war in Tigray? Was it right for Addis Ababa to sign a peace agreement with the TPLF? Some say effectively throwing Eritrea under the bus.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that the Eritrean side would feel very much betrayed by the Prime Minister's government in Ethiopia. However, that betrayal process did not start with Eritrea. It actually started from within Ethiopia. As my colleague from Cambridge was stating, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed because of the peace initiative he took with Eritrea. But also there were other developments within Ethiopia. That's the release of political prisoners and also calling on Ethiopian armed rebels to return to Ethiopia and be part of the political process. However, very soon he started reversing this policy and betraying in the process those who accepted his call to return to a peaceful political process like the Oromo Liberation Front. The Tigrayans were, by the way, among the people who also welcomed Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and also had hosted him in Mekelle for a public meeting. And there were also other people like Lemma Magersa and others. So the process of betrayal and reversing of policies began from within Ethiopia, and it continued regionally. And if I may just add one point on this issue, on the regional one, the issue of access to the sea would not have been a problem had Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed continued in the same process that he started, creating friendships with the Somali government and the Eritrean governments. The expectation
before you go too far, because I do want to speak a lot about the Red Sea port in a second, but first let me get Mukarram's take on the analysis of the fallout from the Tigray war. Do you think Asmara has a right to feel betrayed when Ethiopia went and signed a peace that many say was desperately needed within Ethiopia to stop the war and the hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, from what we've heard, dying within Ethiopia's borders?
Well, let me only make a brief point about your first question, concerning who is threatening a war. I think although officially the Ethiopia's foreign minister spokesperson, I think Gedeon Timotheos, made it clear that the Eritrean government is making practical efforts basically to start off essentially the expected in some ways war between the two countries. But that being said, obviously the Ethiopian government, particularly the current administration, made it clear, unlike probably those successive political regimes in Ethiopian modern political history, that Ethiopia needs an access to the Red Sea by hook and hook, whatever that might mean. But again, to talk about betrayal would be a little bit, I think, exaggerated. In essence, the Pretorian agreement was not necessarily, from my vantage point, an agreement spearheaded by the Ethiopian government. I mean, the Abiy Ahmed-led administration. I think it was, for the most part, led by Olusegun Obasanjo, regional organization, the African Union, Western European countries, and the United States. All have played their own roles in making sure that the key actors who played a very foundational role, essentially, in the fighting that unfortunately led to the death of nearly, I think, 500,000 citizens.
Okay. Mukarram, I have to be honest, I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you. Hopefully we can get that sound corrected for me. But let me ask William what he makes of the two divergent opinions here, and who, again, from an observer's standpoint, feels that or who should feel that they have been more aggrieved, if that's even possible, or do they both hold equal responsibility for the tensions having risen now to this point?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be able to sort of adjudicate helpfully on that, but we can certainly very much understand the Eritrean concern about any Ethiopian designs upon Assab or Massawa or other parts of Eritrea. So clearly, Ethiopia and Abiy's regional ambitions there, with regards to ending the gaining coastal access, it's pretty understandable about the concerns that has caused. I think, as you said, that peace was very necessary in Ethiopia, and what we've seen afterwards is the difficulties. I mean, the fellow panelists talked about the return of political prisoners back to Ethiopia at the time of the peace agreement with Eritrea. Well, that's one thing, but then actually producing a new political settlement in Ethiopia is another thing. We've seen a similar situation with the end of the Tigray war. There may have been improved relations between Abiy and some parts of the TPLF in Tigray, but of course, Abiy's relations with elements in Amhara, the Fano rebels notably, who were on his side, the federal government side during the war, they have nosedived, and of course it caused these problems with Eritrea. So we have all these divergent political interests and just major entrenched divisions, which has made it very hard to get a comprehensive settlement. And instead what we see is these fracturing, changing alliances, and people supporting different proxy actors at different times to further their interests. So, both sides have their grievances, and really the fundamental problem is coming to some sort of comprehensive settlement, which would create peace within the two nations, between them and more broadly in the region. Okay,
let me ask Abdul Rahman, from an Eritrean standpoint now, kind of complicated question, but strategically, could Eritrea simply undermine Addis Ababa via proxy right now in Asmara or elsewhere? Because some could argue that Eritrea does have the benefit of its own kind of internal stability that Ethiopia doesn't have. Or would Asmara not be so cynical as to work against Ethiopia via proxy in its own territory?
Interestingly, the proxy war in the Horn of Africa, probably maybe across the world, has been something of a norm in political issues and political conflicts. There has been relations of the Eritrean government with Ethiopian rebels, and so does the Ethiopian government also has relations with Eritrean rebels. So supporting one side's opposition against the other, it's quite common, and I wouldn't rule it out on this situation. But if I may mention on the issue of the Pretoria Agreement between the TPLF and the Ethiopian federal government, the Eritrean position on this was, yes, it was done without their proper consultation and coordination. However, they've never stood against it. And this was clear in the president of Eritrea's interviews, both in Asmara and Nairobi. He had no issues with the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement. So sometimes this issue is raised by the Ethiopian side to oversimplify their drive to acquire access to the Red Sea. Apart from that, the Pretoria Agreement is still in the ownership of the two signing sides. And if any failure of the implementation is to be looked at, it will always be either side or both who will be failing the Pretoria Agreement. In this case, both are Ethiopians.
Okay.
The third and final point on this issue, the Ethiopian rebels have already been in existence fighting against the Ethiopian government for a long time. So they're quite well armed and well trained. And even if they need Eritrean support, there won't be any major involvement of the Eritrean side in this case, but beyond the political and maybe some public relations and media support.
Okay. Mukarram, if you'd like to respond to that, go ahead. Or I can...
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let me make, I think, two specific maybe points. The first one, I think, concerns the Nobel Peace Prize. I think this is one of the most talked about but much less analyzed state of affair, meaning many, statesmen from many parts of the world awarded with that Nobel Peace Prize. But it wouldn't mean anything, essentially, if you take a look at the nature of relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea since the 1990s. It has always been driven by accumulated grievances, socioeconomic, political, ethnic, and multi-layered problems. And as such, that Nobel Peace Prize and the approachment, the interaction between the Eritrean Isaias Afwerki and Abiy Ahmed was something symbolic, but not substantively meaningful. And as such, had it not been managed that way, meaning if it was really deep down and substantively meaningful, such short-lived suspension would have been much more meaningful, meaning stronger partnership and cooperation would have been possible. So my point again is that the Nobel Peace Prize, again, may have in some ways recognized symbolically the effort, the attempt to relate, to come together and forge lasting relations. So it already signaled, it doesn't necessarily heralded in much more anticipated interstate relations between the two significant related countries. That's the first point. The second point which I would like to get across is I think the speaker from Eritrea, from England, an Eritrean speaker, he talked about some sort of natural aversion, a propensity, proclivity, a sort of hate against Isaias Afwerki. That's not really the state of affairs in Ethiopia. That may be the case among the TPLFites who have had historically deeply entrenched relations with members of the PFDJ, the Eritrean People Liberation Front, Isaias Afwerki-led administration. But when it comes to the the majority of Ethiopian political elites, the academics and normal citizens like me, we don't have that sort of prejudice and negative assessment of Isaias Afwerki's decisions and their actions. I think that's misleading. It needs to be, I think, corrected.
Okay. William, if you'd like to comment on that, go ahead. But I'd like to ask you, actually, because the clock is against us, if you really think these two countries are on the actual precipice of war, as some in the media have said, because, first of all, internally with Ethiopia, you know those internal conflicts of its own are putting a lot of pressure on Ethiopian forces, who some say have been spread very thin already. There's also the issue of, if both go to war, would they get any needed support from allies abroad? Or would there be too much pressure from the outside for them to maintain some sort of peace so that they wouldn't start an armed conflict?
It's definitely a mixed picture, as in, clearly we have a very volatile situation. We see the sort of diplomatic hostility, the proxy activity, certain amount of military maneuvering. But I don't think there's any reason to think that we're, already on an inevitable path to imminent war here. Instead, I think we're sort of stuck in this very volatile, dangerous political situation, something which could be triggered by some sort of flashpoint because it is combustible. And I think also it's a similar situation in terms of the external involvement here. Clearly, we don't have effective, regional, continental or international diplomacy here, which is really actively involved in the matter and affecting it in a positive way, which makes it a more dangerous situation. But then at the same time, given all the instability we have, I don't think any of those regional actors, although clearly they have their allegiances, we see different Gulf actors taking different positions broadly, but I don't think we have any external, powerful external players who are really pushing for this war as well. So it's a mixed picture, and I think the most dangerous aspect is that the underlying political problems within Ethiopia, within Eritrea, between the two leaderships that have created this situation, they're very difficult to see a resolution to. But perhaps it means that we are more stuck rather than heading into an inevitable conflict.
Okay, Abdurrahman, I wanted to get back to the Red Sea port issue before we run out of time. So let me ask you from this standpoint: is there a peaceful way for Ethiopia to get better access to the port of Assab without using force? You seem to allude to the fact that you think they lost an opportunity to do that. But is there still an opportunity for a peaceful resolution to that? Go ahead.
Absolutely. There is first of all, Ethiopia is entitled to access to the sea as a landlocked country. International law allows that. And I don't think Eritrea would benefit by denying Ethiopia access to the Red Sea. In fact, there is a huge benefit for both countries by allowing Ethiopia access to the sea. The problem is when it comes to wanting to annex a sovereign territory of a country, that's where this issue of tension is coming from. It's not because Eritrea or Somalia or Djibouti denied access to the Red Sea to Ethiopia. The initial beginning of Abiy Ahmed in power was quite promising, and there could have been even a confederation of the Horn of African countries of Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And Ethiopia would have had even freer access, if not cheaper. So there was a huge opportunity there. Unfortunately, right now, what is going on is a demand to take a sovereign territory, including all the territorial waters and maritime resources and so on, and include it into another country's territory, which is unacceptable to any country. Otherwise, Ethiopia has always been using the port of Djibouti, for example, for its imports and exports, and it could still use about 8 ports in the region, down from Kismayo all the way to Port Sudan. There is no denial of access to the sea because there is mutual benefit in allowing that, but that's not the issue here.
Okay, let me ask Mukarram, though, if you believe that's true. Has Ethiopia missed, sounds like, a number of opportunities to secure fair access to Assab port that would be mutually beneficial, and not just for Ethiopia and Eritrea, but for the entire Horn of Africa?
I think there are a number of options for the Ethiopian government insofar as access to the Red Sea is concerned. I think the Berbera deal has not yet been aborted. I mean, it has not been officially backtracked by not only by the Ethiopian government or even the Hargeisa administration. Of course, there is a suspension of progression in realizing that deal. We don't know in which direction that would be going. And I think the government must look for, I think, the point which I agree with the other guests is that wire-laid, I mean, forceful approach to garnering, access to the sea would be counterproductive for the Ethiopian government, not only for the Ethiopian, essentially for the Horn of Africa in general. So, insofar as peace is concerned, there will always be a way out. So, solution that could be meaningful for all the stakeholders in the region.
Okay, Mukarram, that will unfortunately have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers, because we are completely out of time. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.